After World War II, the Allies decided to divide the defeated Germany into 4 zones. Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union were each given temporary control of one of these zones. They similarly divided the capital of Berlin. This joint occupation grew out of the wartime illusion of continued Allied cooperation in the governance of the defeated Germany. However, the tensions between the US and the USSR escalated into the Cold War. America and the Soviet Union both worried that the reunited Germany could turn into a strong ally for the other side in the Cold War. As such, they decided to keep Germany weak and divided. The 4 occupiers of Germany met in 1947 at the London Conference of Ministers and decided to make Germany's division more permanent. Stalin began the Berlin blockade on June 23, 1948, to oust the West from Berlin. The roads, railways, and waterways linking West Berlin to the western sector of Germany were all closed, and the electricity supply from east to West Berlin was cut. Rather than direct military confrontation, the West triumphed by supplying Berlin by air. American and British planes flew more than 200,000 flights to Berlin and delivered food and coal to West Berliners. Stalin ended the blockade in early 1949 when he saw it was ineffective. The blockade ended any cooperation between the East and West. It resulted in Germany's official division in 1949. West Germany, which remained capitalist, became a separate nation ruled by the Western Allied powers. East Germany, formerly called the German Democratic Republic, was controlled by the Soviet Union. After East Germany was established as a Soviet satellite state, the imposition of communism there became a major priority. The Red Army and the Soviet secret police began the task. Walter Ulbricht, the head of East Germany, was a tough Stalinist. He wanted the nation to pursue the construction of full socialism, further restricting the workers and reducing the availability of consumer goods. To help do this, exiled German communists living in the Soviet Union returned and were installed in key political positions. In 1946, the Soviets forced the German Communist Party and Social Democrats to merge into a single left-wing party, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, or SED. Originally, the new party pursued a relatively open and independent policy that included denazification, political pluralism, and state intervention in the economy. However, the party became a hierarchical matrix political force that openly acknowledged Soviet influence. The Soviet Union seized power fairly seamlessly after the Berlin blockade, and now it forced East Germany to model its own system of government. It consolidated its power fairly well from this standpoint. Later, with the military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact of 1955, East Germany and the other Soviet satellite states became formally tied to the USSR. East Germany was run as a Stalinist authoritarian state. This meant that factories, banks, and farms were seized and organized under the communist system. Private enterprise was nationalized, agriculture was collectivized, and 5-year plans were introduced to develop heavy industry. Furthermore, the East German economy was integrated into the Soviet Union's overall economy. The regime in East Germany was authoritarian since only the Communist Party was allowed to have any say in government affairs. The government had a central committee, much like in Moscow. The state operated under democratic centralism, which meant in practice that the SED was a monolithic party in which the lines of decision-making run from top to bottom. It controlled the nation through censorship, suppression of religious freedom, political purges, and the presence of Soviet troops. It was required that communist ideology be taught in schools. Supported by the USSR, the SED developed an extensive propaganda network that included Neues Deutschland newspapers and the Neuer Weg publishing house. The goal was, through messages repeated again and again in ritualistic fashion, to indoctrinate the masses and convince them of the regime's legitimacy. The propaganda also emphasized to East German citizens that the communist way of life was far superior to capitalism. It reminded citizens of the threats by Western powers to destroy their way of life. This propaganda was clearly not completely effective, however. West Germany experienced an economic miracle in the 1950s and 60s that did not reach East Germany. The forced collectivization of farms and socialization ruined the economy. In fact, many East Germans fled to West Germany because of the vastly higher living standards there. Before the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, 2.5 million East German citizens had walked across the border to live in West Germany. Opposition and dissent in East Germany was dealt with harshly. Perhaps the most notable feature of state control was the terrifying secret police force known as the Stasi, East Germany's version of the USSR's KGB. However, the Stasi may have actually been more effective at monitoring its people than the KGB. From 1945 until 1989, some 200,000 Germans died either directly or indirectly as a result of communist policies. From 1950 to 1989, some 250,000 people were imprisoned, of whom 10% perished. 1 out of every 50 East Germans were directly involved as spies or informants. This meant that the Stasi had files on 6 million East Germans, half of the total adult population. It earned the country the distinction of being the most heavily infrastructured in terms of domestic espionage in history. In this sense, the Soviets were quite effective at consolidating their power enough to monitor the East German population so well. Overall, the Soviets did not have too much trouble from East Germany since they had fairly successfully seized and consolidated power there. East Germany was one of the most successful countries in the Soviet bloc, though they were still not as well off as Western nations. In fact, East Germany was one of the Soviets' most pliant and loyal ally in Eastern Europe. Lack of international recognition made East Germany dependent on the Soviet Union. This lack of recognition was a failure of the USSR since the rest of the world did not recognize its seizure of power. Capitalist nations viewed West Germany as the only legitimate German state. Communism in East Germany still faced resistance. The best example was how many people left East Germany to seek a better life elsewhere. East Germany experienced a terrible labor drain in which farmers, skilled industrial craftspeople, scientists, and professionals escaped to West Germany. This was an example of the failure of the Soviet consolidation of power. The USSR and East Germany could not keep its population from fleeing to capitalist nations. Between 1945 and 1961, the nation lost a sixth of its entire population to the West. To try and stop this, the USSR urged Walter Ulbricht to tone down his policy of forced collectivization and socialization. This was a near admittance of the failure to make East Germany a true communist state. However, even Moscow's request for Ulbricht to be more conciliatory did not prevent more overt resistance from occurring. The first major challenge to the Soviet rule was the rioting in East Berlin on June 16 and 17, 1953. Continuing repression and excessively high production targets frustrated East German workers who rose up in revolt in Berlin and elsewhere. Red Army tanks were able to put down this protest, but not before it became quite embarrassing to the USSR. No protest of that scale had ever occurred in the Soviet sphere of influence before. After 1953, no major political protests occurred for more than 30 years, a testament to the ruthless effectiveness of the Stasi repression. This proved that the state was fully capable of intimidating its people through brute force, and was therefore effective in that sense. However, the revolts in 1953 proved East Germany had failed to win over the hearts and minds of the people. It could not truly control them. As the East German economy faltered and its population dwindled, Walter Ulbricht pressured Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev to take action. So in 1958, Khrushchev proposed a peace treaty that would recognize the existence of the two Germanys. Later, Khrushchev added to his demands that Berlin be demilitarized and become a free city. He stated that if the German problems were not solved within 6 months, he would turn over control of the city and its approaches to the East Germans. While Khrushchev later dropped his ultimatum, he did bring the issue of control of Germany to the world's attention. A number of international conferences were held on the topic of German reunification, but they all foundered on Russian proposals for incorporation of Berlin into East Germany. As refugees continued to flee and international talks made no progress, Khrushchev appeased Ulbricht by closing the border in Berlin. On August 13, 1961, a barbed wire barrier was constructed between East and West Berlin. A concrete wall later replaced it. The Berlin Wall was a defeat in the sense that it was a visible admission that the communist propaganda message had failed. The Soviets had to create a barrier to keep the people in the East. It meant that East Germany could not force its people to be loyal and that communism could not compete with capitalism. It did, however, stabilize the situation in East Germany and put an end to the mass exodus to the West. The question of Germany was settled. Later, Premier Brezhnev of the USSR proclaimed a self-named doctrine in which the Soviet Union would not permit the overthrow of any communist regime once established. This meant that, in his view, Soviet power over East Germany was completely consolidated and could not be overthrown. The Soviets eventually lost control of East Germany as their empire crumbled. During the celebrations of the 49th anniversary of East Germany's founding, newspapers, journals, films, and books attacked the Communist Party and demanded reforms. When the government opened checkpoints in the Berlin Wall, East and West Berliners poured through and dismantled it together. Free elections were held in 1990 and East and West Germany were reunited on October 3, 1990. All in all, East Germany was a particular success in terms of Soviet seizure and consolidation of power. The Soviets did manage to impose a government very much like their own on East Germany, and for the most part the government and the Stasi effectively managed the population. The economy did fairly well relative to the other nations in the Soviet bloc, though there were still problems. Violent resistance was surprisingly minimized even though East Germany had the best access to the capitalist world by means of West Berlin. The biggest issue and a main failure was the East German government could not keep their population intact. The lifestyle in East Germany was too unappealing, and millions of refugees who left before the wall rose represented the failure of communism. East Germany, especially the Berlin Wall, became a symbol of the front lines of the Cold War.